Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. I am your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very old friend, a former neighbor in India, Mr. Anupam Bhattacharya from Singapore. Anupam, welcome to the show.
Hi, Ashutosh. It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Anupam is the founder and CEO of Invictus Search Private Limited, which is focused on food, agribusiness, and finance. And as I mentioned earlier, he is a very, very senior corporate professional before that and has worked in leadership roles in both Carrier and Monsanto. So Anupam, today let's talk Invictus. After such an amazing corporate career, what made you decide to become an entrepreneur?
I think, Ashutosh, that's a very good question. And even while I was in a corporate job, I used to think about entrepreneurship because I used to see so many amazing entrepreneurs, you being one, and the deep impact that you created and others have created. And I felt that, many times I felt that I was being shackled. Okay, I was doing many things. Of course, I always had very meaningful roles, but they were not something that resonated with me inside, right? It means that there was this big brand behind me. There was this corporate voice that asked me to do many things. And I ended up doing things just because the company wanted me to do it. And even when I didn't agree, I had to do them, right? So the entrepreneurial bug, I think, bit me when I was in my 40s. Somehow, you get spoiled by the corporate world, right? A regular paycheck, bonuses, options, big titles, a lot of travel, expense accounts. It becomes very hard to give up those perks, as we call it, right? So I was always looking out for opportunities, and that opportunity came when the company I worked for was acquired by another company, and it didn't make sense for me to stay on. And so I bit the bullet, as they call it, and started Invictus. And actually, I started Invictus a bit later. I first started off my Ascent Advisory, which is an agribusiness consulting firm, because agri and food became very close to my heart while I was, in the corporate world. And I'll explain why. It's a very meaningful industry to be in. And then while I was actually in regional roles out of Singapore, I felt there was a need for a search firm that was really effective in finding the right talent quickly. Okay? Quickly being the buzzword, because when someone leaves or you need somebody, you cannot wait 4 months, 5 months to fill that role. And there were so many search firms. There still are. There are 3,000 licensed search firms in Singapore. But probably a handful of them know how to serve the customer. Understanding the customer, the role, the culture in the organization is so important when you look out for talent, because one size doesn't fit all, Ashutosh, as you know.
Well said.
So that's how it started. So both the ventures are doing fine, but the talent piece is really taking up a lot of my time, and I'm becoming more and more interested. I'm learning new things. I've never worked in HR, but I learn something new every day, so that keeps me going.
Amazing. And as you made the transition from, as you say, big salaries, bonuses, expense accounts, global travel, etc., to now being an entrepreneur. When I remember when I made the transition, I used to run around the office switching off the lights because everything was paid for. So what have been some of your learnings and some of your challenges?
Okay, very good question again. So I think, when you start, right, it's like a typhoon has hit you. Right? I mean, you have to sort of get used to not working for a large organization where everything is taken care of and you're supported by a team of 40, 50 people who are running around you and supporting you, right? You're on your own. So I started off just by myself. I didn't have even an office. So of course now we've got offices now, etc. But very small offices. So suddenly you realize that you're on your own. You don't have financial and human capital backing your ideas. So you got to sort of, you're bootstrapped, right? So you have to get out of this large corporate thing that you were used to. And I think the biggest learning is you have to look at the customer. Okay, what does the customer want? What does the market want? And you may be operating in a crowded space, but as long as you have found a niche for yourself, and you've sort of decided that this is where the market needs you, I think success is cut out for you. I think that was learning number one.
Okay.
The second thing is being by yourself, you need to prioritize. You cannot do everything. Okay.
Correct.
So there will be 100 things that come on your table, but you got to decide what are the top 3 where you can have the most impact. Not only personally, but on your customers, on your business, on your entity, etc. The third big learning, I think it's okay to fail. Okay, that mindset, we've always so worried about failure in the corporate world. What will my boss think? I won't get a promotion, I won't get a bonus. So when you are starting out on your own, it's very important to understand it's okay to fail and okay to pivot. As long as you learn from that failure and you sort of know what to do next. Because you can get into this paralysis mode very fast with failure.
Correct.
So I think these are my top 3.
That's fascinating. So moving on, Anupam, when I was in the corporate world, and I'm talking of the late 80s, early 90s, when I was actually being found, looked out for by search firms, they used to be called headhunters.
Right.
I'd like to get a perspective from you as one of the newer people of the search firms. When did the headhunters of the 80s and 90s evolve into the search firms of today? And what have been some of the significant changes?
Very interesting again. So I think the industry is still evolving. And, people talk about artificial intelligence, technology in recruiting. I think, this is my personal opinion, of course, that relationships and networks are extremely important. They were important even when the so-called headhunter used to go around, right? You would remember those people were amazing at knowing almost everybody.
Correct.
In a particular industry or geography. So to a certain extent, that still holds true. I mean, when we hire for leadership roles, of course, LinkedIn is a very powerful tool today, which was not there those days.
Correct.
So in a way, there is a platform, but I can tell you for the roles that we search, the amount of diligence that goes behind in terms of cross-checking references, in terms of looking at other social media, in terms of talking to the person's peers, how they were. So it's become much more detailed. I think people talk about technology. I think technology plays a role for initial screening, even for entry-level roles. Technology doesn't, has not displaced the human element. So it's become, I think it's still evolving. And as I said, unfortunately, in this industry, there are no entry barriers. So anybody and everybody has got in. And I think that's giving the industry a little bit of a, what would I say, a question mark. But generally, good headhunters or good search firms have people who have worked in leadership roles. They know what a leader is made up of, where to find the best leaders. And that's why they are effective and successful. So it's evolving. There are, a myriad of search firms. I think search firms also have got into specialisms. Okay. They're not like operating across all spaces. So there are industry specific, like for example, we do food and agri. There are firms that do industrial. And I think there's a growing realization that it's a very human sort of a service. So it's not only the company that is good, but it's the partner or the consultant that's on your account, that makes a big difference.
Fascinating. So, your response, Anupam, gives me a segue to my next question. That, you focused on food, agribusiness, and finance.
Right.
What would you say is the reason for such a sharp kind of a segmentation that you've done to the business?
So it started actually during my corporate career, Ashutosh. Food or agri, let's start with agri, is such an impactful industry. When you realize that today we have 7 billion people in the world, and that population is going to grow to 10 billion people by 2050. The land mass is fixed. So that means productivity has to go up by 50% at least, if not more, to sort of cater to feeding these 10 billion people, feeding and providing clothes, right? So that's really daunting. Today, if you see, the picture is scary. If these improvements don't happen, okay, the world will be, there'll be probably 2 to 3 billion people going hungry, which is very, very scary. So the industry needs extraordinary leaders to drive this vision. Food for all, hunger for none is the tagline used by a very well-known agri company. So if that were to happen, you need leaders, right? So whether that's scientific leadership, whether that's commercial leadership, whether that's the functional leaderships like finance, HR, etc., to sort of drive this change in ensuring that nobody goes hungry in 2050. So I think that's where this whole thought came about, that let's be a specialized search firm that addresses this need. In terms of finance, CFO, the financial officers practice, as I call it, I've been a CFO for 20 years. Naturally, those skills are very hard to forget. And again, I still believe that one of the key roles below the CEO in any company is the CFO.
Absolutely.
Okay? So that's why, you need somebody who has been a CFO to get you the best CFO.
Fascinating. So, Anupam, a lot of people who I speak to are a lot of young people.
Right.
It's almost like a prestigious thing to say, hey, I got a call from a search firm today.
Right.
I have a couple of questions for you relating to this.
Right.
Number one is, at what stage of one's career does one suddenly come onto the radar of a search firm? And number two, what should one do to get onto that radar?
Again, a great question. I think the sweet spot, if you see that when search firms start noticing you, is when you are reaching that 10-year mark, because that allows you to sort of, put some runs on your scorecard, as I call it, right? It's not too early. It also, shows potential. Okay, the early indicators of high potential talent emerge at that stage, and hopefully you've done about at least 5 roles since you graduated or entered. So I think that is when it starts. Now, what gets you into the radar are a couple of things. How visible you are. Now with social media, of course, when we started, there was no social media. So we had to really, I guess, work hard to be visible. But now social media gives you that platform. Second, I think, what search firms look for is, have you done any roles which are truly transformational and unique and have created an impact? For example, I'll give you an example. Africa is a huge opportunity for agri. So if you work in Africa and there's not enough talent in Africa, you'll be on my radar. Okay. So these are some ways. Okay, you have to be visible. You may be brilliant, but if you're not visible, you won't be on people's radar. So I think it's very important to be visible.
Very interesting. And yet, you spoke of social media.
Right.
There are lots of positives and a lot of negatives of social media. Very often young people react on social media impulsively.
Yes.
How important is that? And do you track that also?
Yes, it throws some interesting insights. Okay, if you're not contributing meaningfully to social media conversations, I would be a little wary, because that means you're really not leveraging the platform as you should. Like, for example, you see LinkedIn has become a lot of, I mean, the platform is being used by many people in not the right way. So we would sort of be a little bit wary of such people. But by and large, I think responsible leadership pretty much views these responsibly, and it's a minority, I would say, today, that we would be very careful about.
Very interesting. So I'm going to move on. Let me talk to you a little bit now about culture.
Mm-hmm.
As a professional manager, you have worked across multiple cultures.
Right.
As a search firm, I'm sure you are searching across multiple cultures. I would love to get your perspective on how does culture impact hiring across a large number of companies.
Yeah, it has a huge role to play, because as a search firm, I think we are engaged to sort of make sure that we give the right talent that is suited for a company's culture. If that was not important, I guess everybody would be out of business, because people would advertise online and there'd
Correct.
be, right?
Correct.
So it's very important to understand what that culture is. For example, a family-run business is going to have a very different cultural set of principles that they operate on as compared to a multinational. So when we, for example, work for a small and SME, as we call it here, a small and medium enterprise, we really take pains to understand what is the owner's vision and mission.
Okay.
What does he want the company to achieve? What sort, and then we go into finding that type of talent. So obviously, if you are getting a leadership talent for an SME, you would really need to see or look out for someone that's worked in that environment before, because the familiarity, it can take years for somebody to get familiar with that sort of thing. So I think familiarity is very important, because we don't want to provide talent that is not fit for the organization. That is a disaster for our reputation. And I think our success lies in understanding that culture. So whether it's the vision and mission, whether it's the business model also. I mean, I think when an owner doesn't like everything to be very set and operates on informal principles, a person who has only worked in multinationals is going to find it very, very hard to adapt to that.
Well said.
So culture is extremely important.
Very well said. So one more question, and if I have time, I'll move to a few questions for you personally. A little while ago, you mentioned that when you look at a top leader, you do a lot of diligence.
Right.
What are the things you look for when you do a diligence?
So, we start off with the person's CV or resume, right?
Correct.
And there are a lot of things that they mention as achievements. So I think step number one is to verify whether those are true or not.
Correct.
And it's very easy in today's day and age. So that's number one. I think the second thing that I personally am very passionate about is the integrity aspect. Okay, that is such an important leadership trait. So we spend a lot of time doing various sort of reference checks, background checks, etc., to understand whether the person is, generally being ethical and has the right level of integrity. Because that to me is a non-negotiable.
Correct. Correct.
And third, I think we talk to people who have worked for this particular leader, because I think people who have worked for you are, I think, very good judges of your leadership capabilities, to get their opinion, and also the bosses of this particular person, right, in the past, because again, they can be critical and they can also be a very valuable. So we do a number of checks, and then we sort of present the candidate to the person. Wow. Believe me, in today's day and age, Ashutosh, this doesn't take too much time today. If
Okay.
you're reasonably networked, I think you can get a reasonable idea of that person in 7 to 10 days. That's all.
Fascinating, fascinating. So I've got time for two more questions for you. My next question to you is that, in Anupam, in a career which has been so amazing, a lot of successful professionally and now a successful entrepreneur, what would you say are three key milestones or pivot points in your life or your career?
So I'll take life because in my career, there have been so many. It'll be hard to sort of finish this discussion. So in my life, I think I'll mention the three. I think the first pivot point was when I decided to start a career in finance or commerce. In India, it used to be commerce. So nobody in my family, I think going back 15 generations, had, they were all engineers, doctors, scientists. Nobody had embarked on a career in finance. So when I said this to my dad, he flipped. Okay, he said, what's going on, right? You will not be successful. But then I was very passionate about finance from a very young age, and I chose that career, and touch wood, I've not done badly. So that was definitely a pivot point. The second pivot point is when I got married to Shonali. I think that, and I started changing because I was a very different person before I got married, and the impact and effect that she's had on me has been simply phenomenal.
It's amazing.
The third pivot point, I think, is when our two daughters were born, right? They were both born in Singapore. Both the cases, I almost missed, being in Singapore the day they were being born. And the amount of joy and happiness that I've got by being with them and learning from them and watching them grow up. These three, I think, have been the most defining.
How wonderful. How wonderful. Anupam, my last question to you, and this is for the many, many young people who will listen to our conversation. For someone who's reached right to the top, what would your advice be to a young individual who's starting off on her or his journey in the corporate world?
Again, a very good question, Ashutosh. So again, looking back, I would like to sort of dwell a little bit on how I approached it. I think, young people who are starting off need to take risks. And in the corporate world, you're presented with a lot of choices.
Correct.
Okay. Roles in global HQ are deemed very, very attractive and, visible. Does it make sense to take that role? Right? Because again, I always went for roles where I would learn from, rather than choosing roles where I would be visible or, people would say that's the politically right role to rise up. I never followed that. For me, learning and finding a purpose in the role, even if it meant going to a hardship location or a very difficult assignment, I would embrace, because at the end of the day, it added value to me. It developed my leadership skills, and I would find meaning in the work that I did. That's very, very important, because, a lot of the roles that are so-called visible and people aspire for are nothing but glorified analyst roles, right? At very senior levels too. So I think the opportunity to create something out of nothing cannot be overlooked.
Very interesting.
And that's how you sort of develop your leadership skills. And you also develop other leaders and there's a different level of happiness and satisfaction that happens when you create a leader in your team who can take over. And I've been very fortunate that all the roles I've left, I've groomed leaders from my team who've taken over my role, which allowed me to move to another role.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Anupam, on that note, thank you so much for speaking to me. Thank you for talking to me about your journey, about Invictus, about the way the entire search firm world works, about how the young people can suddenly start to see light at the end of the tunnel after 10 years to say, oh, now I'm on the radar of my search firm. Thank you for talking to me about your own pivot points and for such amazing advice to young people. Thank you again and good luck.
Thank you, Ashutosh. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.